This is a test. This is a test. Blackologically speaking, this is a test. Travel the Blackological Underground Radio Network at blackology.com. The journey to educate and liberate the black mind. May the content of your character be the knowledge of your culture. A blackological evolutionary theory from the liberation of black intelligence. Let us begin by talking and taking a look at the chronology of Black African culture. The Black African culture has its own time span. It is divided into three areas: prosperity, destruction, and the redevelopment era. We are now in the year 213 of the redevelopment era of Black African culture. The Haitian Revolution, 1789, marks the beginning of the redevelopment of Black African culture. The destruction of the black civilization was the colonial period. The era of prosperity was the multi-ethnic pre-African age. When we look at Black African culture, we look at it through the stages of its identity. We must talk about it in the light of how black people identify themselves, or how they was identified by the oppressors. Let us begin with the era of pre-colonialism. Prior to the European intervention of the motherland, or Al-Kebaland, as it was named or called, black people looked at themselves as part of kingdoms or queendoms. They were identified by local families or groups, or, for the lack of a better word, tribes. They were a multi-ethnic culture. There were also some enterprises and empires, but they were not known or identified as Africans. Even to this day, there are some black people who do not identify themselves as Africans. The black people were known by names such as Va, Hausa, Zulu, Mandingo, etc. The continent was known as the land of the blacks. According to the black scholars, there were great civilizations. There was art, music, ideals in this great land. There was no collective name for the entire people. As time evolved, black people traveled over the world. It is mentioned by Afrocentric scholars, African-centered educators, that black people taught culture throughout the world. In the first stage of collective identity, it was in this period of captivity. This was the colonial period, which included European and Arabs. It was in this era that Africans began to acknowledge their common struggle to be free. They began to be aware that everyone who was in captivity was the same color and from the same place. Black people also were aware that people who were kidnapping them were white and Arab. It is assumed that black people did not know anything about each other. In addition to that, it is believed that black Africans all spoke different languages and could not communicate with each other. This is not true according to Dr. Amos Muhammad Deluxe Sirleaf, a blackologist or a blackological scholar and a graduate of African Studies program at Howard University in 1999. Dr. Sirleaf said, He is a native Liberian and he speaks 9 different languages. This is due to local languages which are spoken in geography of the country and its neighboring countries. It is a tradition of Black African people to be able to speak more than one language because you had to talk to other tribes in your immediate surroundings. So it would have been impossible for Black people in the cargo ships to have no way of communications or not to know each other. It was on the cargo ships that the movement of freedom gained a collective effort. The very first time the movement for freedom was conceived was when a Black person was captured by an oppressive regime. In the times of captivity, there were no airplanes, autos, no trains that could cut the time of transport into minutes or hours. You could not travel from East, South, or North Africa and board a cargo ship before it left the shore. So all the captives had to be taken from the immediate shores of the West Africa in the transatlantic slave trade. And in the Eastern slave trade, the Arab slave trade, they had to be taken from the Eastern shores. The stages of Black identity are as such: Blacks, Africans, captives or bondsmen, slaves, NIGGERs, colored people, Negroes, conscious Black movement, Black African people, and today we see ourselves all as Black people. Black is a term that was used in the 13th and 14th centuries. Blacks is a term that was forced upon us through captivity, but eventually, through the horrors of captivity, we all began to acknowledge and accept the word Black. Black was how the European and Arabs saw Blacks in terms of their color. The Europeans did not look at Blacks as people. African originated from the European landing in North Africa and meeting a people that in that area named Africa, because the Europeans could not pronounce the name correctly. They said it as Africa and also spelled it as such. This name was not collectively identified by the people of the entire continent. The identity of captives or bondsmen was collective disposition of those who were dispersed into the lands by kidnappers. The name was not in the language of the inhabitants of Africa, but it was known to those who were in captivity. Slavery was a condition that was part of the process of breaking down the minds of the captives. It was to convince the captive and those who were born in this inhumanity they were inferior to whites. In order to be a slave, you had to accept that you were a slave and consent to the laws of bondage and subjugation by those who were oppressing you. If not, you could experience severe torture, pain, and even destruction. The term Niger derived from the name Niger that was associated with Nigeria. The Europeans could not speak the name correctly and began to say Niger in a negative way as to dehumanize the captives. Niger is a degrading, and dehumanizing process of maintaining the slave mentality. This identity runs simultaneously with all the stages to ensure the continued inferiority complex. It is the longest lasting of all marginalizing identities because it is passed down through European and Arabic religions and cultures. The only word lasting longer than Nigger is black people or blacks. Colored people is a term used in the 15th and early 18th centuries. This term is applied to blacks who were in slavery. It was also applied to the house slave. It is a civil way of saying that you are a good Nigger and you believe in the training that you have to live up to the white standards, and you believe you were inferior as a colored person. It also meant that you were mixed with white and black and not white. This is a collective identity, national and international. The era of Negro expanded from the 18th to the 20th century. Negro is a stage of negrological thinking. The term was utilized after emancipation. This is a collective worldview that Negro people saw themselves as second class to whites. They believed that they could prove to whites or Europeans and Arabs that they were human by thinking Eurological and Arabic, or as white people or Arabs. Everything that white wanted or did, they did the same. The Negroes studied sociology, psychology, anthropology, and other Eurological studies. They worked on these fields so hard and so long, just as they did in the cotton fields. They did not even have time to work on the development of their own intellectual thought, genius, and creativity. This is the era in which all the great Negro scholars evolved from. This is the stage of emulation, assimilation, mimicking of the Eurological world and the Arabic world. Negroes were made in the image of Europeans and Arabs. A negrological scholar was and is a Negro man or woman who believes and perpetuates the Eurological studies as his or her way of thinking. The Negroes were rewarded with degrees and did not try to even think about creating any sciences of their own. Dr. Carter G. Woodson calls this the miseducation of the Negro. The fear of the Negro was that she would not be accepted by whites. Black consciousness movement is from the 1965 to the 1984. This is the beginning of the BlacCollective era. This is the I am black and proud era. It was in 1965 that Floyd McKissick and Kwame Ture declared that Negro would no longer be, and we would be black people from that day on. This is self-acclaimed black people, according to the land of their birth. If you were from Jamaica, you were a black Jamaican. If you were from France, you were a black Frenchman. If you were from the United States, you were a black American, African American, Afro American, or collectively, black people. If you were in Africa and you were black African or African, the black consciousness stage was and is the era in which black people were aware of their connection with other black people throughout the world. This is the stage of black power as well. In this stage, black solidarity was and is a worldview. Urological assimilation is the stage from 1980 to 1995 and was an era in which the black consciousness was pacified by European values and cultures. We took a break right there. We're coming back. The stage of black consciousness was dismantled by the acquisition of European thought and the assimilation of European studies. The more the black intelligentsia studied urological ideologies, the less conscious they were.